When my husband pulled out of the driveway that Tuesday morning in early March, our dachshund, Pepper, pressed her gray muzzle against the front door glass and watched him go. I watched him too. And when he came back 2 hours later and walked past me without saying a single word, not one, I almost lost my footing in the hallway. Not from fear, not from anger, from laughing so hard my eyes watered. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the full picture. My name is Diane Kowalski. I'm 41 years old. I teach 7th grade English at Ridgeline Middle School, which sits about 4 miles from our neighborhood, a cottage community called Maplewood Pines, tucked just outside the city limits of Cartersville, Ohio. It's the kind of place where the HOA sends passive-aggressive newsletters about holiday lights being left up past January 15th, where everyone knows which family got a new car before the car even arrives, and where the walking path around the pond fills up every evening with retirees and their rolling walkers. It's also, genuinely, beautiful in early spring. The ornamental cherry trees along Birchwood Lane bloom before anything else does, and for about 10 days every March, the whole street looks like something off a calendar. I bought this house. I want to be very clear about that from the start, because it becomes the center of everything. Not my husband Marcus, not his income, not his credit score, not his mother's blessing. Me. My mother, Loretta, saved for 22 years working double shifts as a hospital dietary aide. She scrimped and put away and refused herself small luxuries her whole adult life so that one day she could hand her only daughter something solid. When she retired at 68, she called me into her kitchen, the same kitchen she'd cooked every holiday meal in since I was 7, sat me down at the Formica table, and pushed a check across it. $132,000. Her entire savings. A down payment on a house, she said. For you, Diane, for you to have something that is yours. I cried for 20 minutes. She made me a cup of instant coffee and told me to stop being dramatic. Marcus and I had been married for 19 years by the time any of this happened. 19 years is a long time. Long enough that you stop noticing certain things, the way someone breathes at night, the rhythm of their morning routine, the particular shape their moods take when they're stressed. We met when I was 22, at a summer barbecue hosted by mutual friends in Columbus. He was 30, funny in a quiet way, working in logistics management. He had dark eyes and a habit of listening that I mistook, at 22, for depth. We dated for 2 years, got married in late June, and built a life the way most people do, slowly, imperfectly, with a lot of compromise and a shared calendar, and a joint checking account that was always slightly more depleted than either of us expected. We don't have children. That's a whole separate story, one I won't get into here. What I will say is that it reshaped things between us in ways that neither of us fully admitted. It left quiet spaces in the house that we each filled differently. I filled mine with teaching, with my students, with Pepper, who we adopted 11 years ago as a 2-year-old rescue, and who was now 13 and arthritic, and spent most of her days on a heated orthopedic mat near the radiator. Marcus filled his spaces with golf, with his college buddies, and increasingly with his mother, Carolyn. Carolyn had been a point of friction almost from the beginning of our marriage, though in the early years it was manageable friction, the kind you sand down and paint over. She was a woman who communicated exclusively in implications. She never said, "I don't like Diane." She said things like, "Marcus always seemed happiest when he was around family," while looking directly at me. She never said, "I think you make too much of your job." She said, "It's so admirable the way Diane puts her career first." 19 years of that kind of language leaves marks you can't always locate. She lived about 40 minutes away, in a condo in Westfield Park. Her husband, Marcus's father, passed away 6 years into our marriage. After that, Carolyn started calling more, visiting more, having more opinions about things that weren't her business. Marcus handled it by agreeing with her in private and deflecting in public, which is a particular kind of spinelessness that I spent most of my 30s learning to name correctly. The house in Maplewood Pines came into our lives about 3 years ago, when my mother made that offer. Marcus was enthusiastic. He picked out the neighborhood, actually, drove through Maplewood Pines one Sunday, and called me from the car to say it felt right. I agreed. The house was a 4-bedroom cottage style with a covered front porch and a fenced backyard perfect for Pepper. We closed in April, 2 Aprils ago. My mother's name was not on the deed because she didn't want it to be. "It's yours, baby," she kept saying. I'm just glad I could help. The mortgage was in both Marcus's and my name, but the down payment, every dollar of it, was my mother's money, documented carefully by our realtor and recorded in the closing paperwork. I kept a copy of everything in a fire-safe box in the bedroom closet. Life in Maplewood Pines was, for about 18 months, genuinely good. I loved the porch. I loved the backyard. I loved taking Pepper on slow morning walks down Birchwood Lane while she sniffed every square inch of earth with the seriousness of a forensic investigator. I loved that my mother came for dinner every other Sunday and always brought a casserole, even though I told her repeatedly she didn't need to. I loved that the drive to Ridgeline Middle was 15 minutes on back roads through farmland, which gave me time to mentally prepare for whatever 7th graders were going to throw at me that day. Marcus seemed to like it too. He'd put up a basketball hoop in the driveway. He grilled on weekends. He and the neighbor across the street, a retired postal worker named Ed, started playing chess on Ed's back deck on Saturday mornings. And then, gradually, Carolyn started coming more often. It started innocent enough. She'd come for Sunday dinner. Then she'd come on Saturdays too. Then she'd come midweek, just to drop something off, and somehow still be there when I got home from school at 4:30. Marcus always seemed surprised to see her there, which I stopped believing around the 3rd time. I said nothing. I was good at saying nothing. 19 years had made me very, very good at it. The real shift happened in February of this year. I came home from a long Tuesday, parent-teacher conferences always wrecked me, to find Marcus and Carolyn sitting at the kitchen table with what looked like printed real estate listings spread out between them. I set my bag down. Pepper heaved herself off her mat and limped over to greet me, because Pepper, at least, had never once disappointed me. "What's all this?" I asked. Marcus looked up. He had a specific expression he wore when he'd already decided something and was now preparing to present it as a mutual discussion. I knew that face, the way I knew the sound of the furnace clicking on at 3 a.m. "Mom was thinking," he started. "Mom was thinking," I repeated, not a question. Carolyn smiled her particular smile. "I've been looking at some of the properties in Willowbrook," she said. "There's a lovely 2-bedroom cottage community over there, very similar feel to this one, very quiet." I looked at the listings. I looked at Marcus. "Okay," I said slowly. "Are you planning to move to Willowbrook?" Carolyn tilted her head. "Well, the condo in Westfield Park is getting difficult. The stairs, you know. And I was thinking, given that your mother's generosity helped make all of this possible," she gestured around, "at my house, it seemed only fair that Marcus and I look into what we might be able to do for my situation." I kept my face very still. My mother's generosity, her situation, only fair. "I see," I said. I excused myself, went upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall for about 4 minutes. Pepper had followed me up, slowly, one stair at a time, and she pressed her warm, heavy body against my shin. I put my hand on her back. Downstairs, I could hear Marcus and Carolyn talking in low voices. I couldn't make out the words. I didn't need to. The next morning, I called my mother. "Mom," I said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not get upset yet." There was a pause on her end. Then, in the voice of a woman who has survived 68 years and double shifts and the American healthcare system, "Diane, who do I need to talk to?" "Nobody yet," I said, "but I need you to understand what's happening." I explained. She listened. When I finished, there was another pause. "Baby," she said, "that money was in your name, right? At the closing?" "Yes, Mom." "And you kept the paperwork?" "In the fire-safe box." "Good girl," she said, and then, quietly, "Let them talk." I didn't know yet what she meant by that. I found out soon enough. 2 days later, Marcus came downstairs on a Thursday morning, put on his coat, picked up his keys, and told me he was going over to my mother's house to have a conversation with her. Just like that. Like it was a completely reasonable thing to do. Like my 68-year-old retired mother who had worked her entire life to give me something was someone he could just go reason with. I stood in the kitchen doorway in my work clothes, coffee mug in hand, and I watched him go. Pepper watched from her mat, ears flat. He was gone for 2 hours. When I heard his car pull back into the driveway, I walked to the front door and opened it. He came up the porch steps and stopped when he saw me standing there. His face was doing something I had never quite seen it do before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't embarrassment exactly. It was the particular expression of a man who had walked into a room expecting one thing and found something so completely different that his brain was still catching up. He opened his mouth, closed it, walked past me into the house, not a single word. And I, Diane Kowalski, 41 years old, 7th grade English teacher, daughter of Loretta, owner of this house and this porch, and this arthritic 13-year-old dachshund, I grabbed the doorframe with one hand, pressed the other over my mouth, and laughed until my eyes ran. Because I knew exactly what my mother had said to him, and I knew exactly how she'd said it. What I didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning, that Carolyn wasn't finished, and that the way she planned to fight back would involve the one thing I hadn't seen coming, the one angle I'd left completely unguarded. I found out what that unguarded angle was 3 days later. It came from the last person I expected, Renata Osei, who taught 8th grade math at Ridgeline and had the classroom directly across the hall from mine. Renata and I weren't close friends exactly. We were the kind of colleagues who shared coffee and hallway complaints and covered for each other when one of us needed to duck out early. But she had sharp eyes and sharper instincts, and she'd met Marcus exactly twice at school events, and both times had said afterward with no particular malice, "He seems like the kind of man who's used to things going his way." She appeared in my doorway on a Friday afternoon, after the last bell, while I was grading vocabulary quizzes and trying not to think about the conversation I knew was waiting for me at home. "Your husband called the school today," she said. I looked up. "What?" "He called the main office, asked to speak with Principal Garland." She leaned against the doorframe with her arms crossed, watching me carefully. "I only know because Janet mentioned it to me. She thought it was strange." Janet Pruitt ran the front office with the efficiency of an air traffic controller and the memory of an elephant. If she'd flagged it as strange, it was strange. "What did he want?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Apparently he wanted to discuss whether you were under a lot of stress lately," Renata said, "whether you'd been acting erratically, whether there were any concerns about your mental state." The vocabulary quizzes in my hand went very still. "He framed it as being worried about you," she continued. "Garland didn't say much from what Janet heard, but he did take the call, Diane, and it lasted about 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Marcus had spent 12 minutes on the phone with my principal, trying to plant the idea that I was mentally unstable. Not because he believed it, because he was building something, laying groundwork for something I couldn't quite see the shape of yet, but which I could suddenly feel bearing down on me the way you feel a weather front before it arrives, a pressure shift, a drop in the light. I thanked Renata. I waited until she left. Then I sat in my empty classroom for a long time while the heating vents clicked, and a quarter moon of light moved slowly across the whiteboard, and I thought about what 19 years of a certain kind of marriage actually does to you. Not the obvious damage, the subtle kind, the kind that makes you question your own perceptions, your own memory, your own reliability as a witness to your own life. I drove home. Marcus was in the kitchen making pasta. The table was set. He asked if I wanted wine. I said no. We ate dinner and he talked about a project at work, and I answered in the right places. And the whole time I was watching him the way you watch a stranger you've somehow agreed to share a house with, trying to figure out what he actually wants and what he's actually capable of. That weekend, Carolyn came for dinner. I made the food. I always made the food. She sat at my kitchen table and asked about my mother's health, which she had never once asked about in 19 years, and the warmth in her voice was so precisely calibrated that I almost admired it. Almost. "Loretta must find the winters hard," she said. "At her age." "She's fine," I said. "Of course." A pause. "It's so lovely that you two are close. Family is everything, isn't it, Marcus?" Marcus nodded and refilled her water glass. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark and listened to Marcus breathe, and I ran the numbers the way I'd been refusing to run them for years. The house was in both our names on the mortgage, but the down payment, my mother's $132,000, was documented as a gift from one private individual to another. If things deteriorated, if this became a legal matter, if Marcus decided to fight, I knew what the paperwork said. I also knew that paperwork doesn't always speak as loudly as the person with the louder lawyer. I got up at 2 a.m, went downstairs, sat at the kitchen table in the dark, and cried. Not dramatically, quietly, the way you cry when you're not trying to get anyone's attention, when there's no one to perform grief for. Pepper heard me from her mat in the corner and lifted her head, and I went and sat on the floor next to her and put my face in the loose, warm skin of her neck, and she let me. She always let me. This is the part of the story I don't usually tell people, not the confrontations, not the legal maneuvering. This part, the 2 a.m. floor part, where it stopped being about Carolyn's housing situation or Marcus's phone call to my principal or any specific grievance I could name, and became about something older and heavier. The understanding that I had spent 19 years slowly, incrementally, without ever quite noticing, giving away pieces of my own authority in my own life. Small pieces. A preference not expressed, a boundary not drawn, a thing I said I didn't mind when I did mind. I had been so careful to be easy to love that I had made myself easy to dismiss, and now someone was testing exactly how far that dismissal could go. I wiped my face on my sleeve. I looked at Pepper. She looked back at me with the ancient, patient eyes of a dog who has lived 13 years and has no interest in my internal monologue. "Okay," I said out loud, to no one, to both of us. "Okay." The next morning was Saturday. Marcus went to play chess with Ed. I waited until his car turned the corner, and then I called my cousin Ren. Ren Kowalski, my father's niece, technically, which made her my first cousin, was a paralegal at a family law firm in Columbus. She was 37, twice divorced, and had what I can only describe as a finely tuned radar for exactly this kind of situation. We weren't in regular contact. We talked at Thanksgiving and occasionally texted about nothing important, but I had called her once before in my life, during a bad stretch about 10 years ago, and she had given me the most practical advice I'd ever received from a family member, which was, write everything down and keep copies of everything, because memory is not a legal document. She picked up on the second ring. "Diane," she said, "it's early." "I know. I need to talk to you about something." There was the small sound of her setting down a mug. "Tell me." I told her everything, start to finish, the listings on the kitchen table, Carolyn's comment about my mother's generosity, the phone call to Principal Garland, the 12 minutes, the way Marcus had come back from my mother's house unable to form a sentence, all of it. Ren was quiet for a moment when I finished. "The call to your principal," she said. "That's the thing that concerns me most." "Me too." "Do you know what he said exactly?" "Not exactly, just what Renata told me." "You need to know exactly," she said. "You need to request a formal record of that call from the school administration. You have every right to do that. And Diane, I need you to think carefully about whether anything else like that might have happened that you don't know about yet." My stomach turned. "What do you mean?" "I mean that when someone starts building a narrative about a spouse's mental state, they usually don't make one call. They make several. They talk to people. They document. They prepare." Her voice was careful and precise. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to make sure you're not behind." I hadn't thought about being behind. I had been so focused on responding to what was happening that I hadn't considered that someone else had already been several moves ahead of me. "What do I do?" I asked. "First, don't move anything. Don't change anything. Don't give him any reason to say you're acting erratically, because right now that's the story he's building. Second, get your paperwork together. Everything related to the house, the down payment, your mother's gift documentation. Third, she paused, I want you to come to Columbus and talk to one of my colleagues. Not me, because I can't be your attorney. But there's a woman in our office named Patricia Lund. She handles exactly this kind of thing, and she's very, very good. Patricia Lund. I wrote the name on the back of an envelope. Ren, I said, do you think it's that serious? Another pause, longer this time. I think, she said, that a man who calls his wife's employer to question her mental health before any legal proceeding has even started is a man who is preparing for a legal proceeding. I looked around my kitchen, the covered front porch through the window, the fenced backyard, the ornamental cherry trees just starting to bud on Birchwood Lane, my mother's $132,000 made real and solid and standing around me. Okay, I said, for the second time in 12 hours, but this time it meant something different. I made an appointment with Patricia Lund for the following Thursday. I requested the call log from Ridgeline Middle School's main office by email that same afternoon, copying Principal Garland and the district administrative coordinator, formally, professionally, with no explanation beyond the fact that it was a request regarding a third-party inquiry about a staff member, which I had every procedural right to make. I pulled the fire-safe box out of the bedroom closet and sat at the kitchen table and went through every document inside it, one by one, making a second set of copies that I drove to my mother's house and put in her closet. My mother didn't ask many questions. She watched me sort papers and she made coffee, and she said when I finished, "That woman has been planning this for longer than you think." "I know," I said. "Does Marcus know what he's doing, or is he just doing what she tells him?" I thought about that. About 19 years of him agreeing with her in private and deflecting in public. About the way he'd walked back into the house after visiting my mother, that expression on his face, whatever it was. "I think," I said slowly, "he started out doing what she told him, but I think somewhere along the way he decided he wanted the same thing she does." My mother looked at me. She had the kind of eyes that don't soften when they're being kind. They just go very still, very direct. "And what's that?" she asked. "The house," I said, "or the money from it, or the leverage. I'm not sure which one yet." She nodded once, the way she nodded when something confirmed what she'd already suspected. "Good," she said. "Now you know what you're dealing with." On Wednesday night, the night before my appointment with Patricia Lund, Marcus came home late from what he said was a work dinner. He smelled like restaurant food, and he was in an unusually good mood, the kind of good mood that has a slightly artificial brightness to it, like a light bulb running slightly too hot. He kissed me on the cheek in the kitchen. He asked if there was anything to eat. He made himself a sandwich and told me about a story he'd heard from a colleague and laughed at his own telling of it. I watched him. He didn't know about Ren. He didn't know about Patricia Lund. He didn't know that I had already requested the call log, that the copies of every document were already at my mother's house, that I had spent the last 4 days quietly, methodically, with no visible change in my behavior, preparing for whatever he had been preparing for much longer. He thought he was 12 moves ahead of me. He had no idea I'd just joined the game. He finished his sandwich, rinsed the plate, said he was tired, and went upstairs. I heard the shower run. I heard the creak of the floorboards that meant he'd settled into bed. I sat at the kitchen table a little longer. Pepper was asleep on her mat, her ribcage rising and falling in the slow, deep rhythm of an old dog who has no enemies and no debts. The cherry trees outside were invisible in the dark, but I knew they were there. Those 10 days of bloom almost here, almost begun. My phone lit up on the table. A text from a number I didn't recognize. I picked it up. "This is Gail Mercer. I'm Carolyn's neighbor at Westfield Park. I think there are some things you should know. Are you available to talk?" I stared at those words for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet around me. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the cherry trees on Birchwood Lane were invisible in the dark, but I knew they were there, and I knew they were about to bloom, and I knew that nothing about this moment was going to be simple. I typed back, "Yes, I'm available now." Gail Mercer called me within 30 seconds. She was in her early 70s, she said. She'd lived next door to Carolyn at Westfield Park for 11 years. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had decided to do something she'd been putting off for a while and was going to get through it before she changed her mind. "I want you to know I'm not doing this to cause trouble," she said. "I'm doing this because what I heard was wrong, and I've been sitting on it for 2 weeks, and it's been bothering me every single day." "I'm listening," I said. What Gail told me over the next 25 minutes was this. Carolyn had been hosting a woman named Deborah Fitch at her condo on a near-weekly basis for the past several months. Gail knew Deborah because Deborah had once done some bookkeeping work for the Westfield Park HOA. Deborah was, among other things, a notary public. Gail had bumped into Deborah in the hallway outside Carolyn's door on 2 separate occasions, and on the second occasion, she'd caught a glimpse through the open door of what looked like documents spread across Carolyn's dining table, and she'd heard Carolyn say, clearly, to someone on the phone, "If it goes the way Marcus thinks it will, I'll need a place to land by summer." I wrote that down on the back of the same envelope where I'd written Patricia Lund's name. "If it goes the way Marcus thinks it will," I said. "That's what she said," Gail confirmed. "Word for word. I've got a good memory for things like that. My late husband used to say I should have been a court reporter." "Gail," I said carefully, "would you be willing to repeat any of this to an attorney, formally?" A pause. Then, "That's why I called you, honey." I thanked her. I got her phone number and her address. I sat very still after we hung up, my hand flat on the table, and I thought about what it meant that Carolyn had been meeting regularly with a notary public. I thought about what documents might need a notary. I thought about the mortgage. I thought about the deed. I called Wren at 8:15 in the morning. She answered on the first ring. "I have a witness," I said. The appointment with Patricia Lund happened 2 days later on Thursday, and I drove to Columbus alone in the early morning, before Marcus was awake. I left a note on the counter that said I had an early errand. Perfectly true. Patricia Lund was a small woman in her early 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she had the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people said terrible things about each other and had learned to absorb it without reacting. She listened to everything I told her. She asked questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. She went through the copies of my documents with the focused attention of someone reading a contract rather than a life story, which was, I realized, exactly what she was doing. When she got to the closing paperwork, the documentation of my mother's gift, the down payment records, the deed, she set her glasses on her nose and read in silence for a long time. "This is clean," she said finally. "Your mother's gift is properly documented. The down payment is traceable. The deed has both your names on it, which is standard for a married couple, and doesn't disadvantage you in the way some people think it does in Ohio, given the origin of the funds." She looked at me over her glasses. "What concerns me more is the call to your employer." "That's what my cousin said too." "I need you to get me that call log," she said. "Whatever the school's administrative records show, and I want to speak with your colleague who witnessed the conversation with your principal." "Renata," I said. "She's willing to talk." Patricia nodded. She wrote something down. "I also want to speak with Gail Mercer," she said, "because what you've described, a notary visiting the mother-in-law's home repeatedly, documents on the table, a comment about needing a place to land by summer, that tells me someone has been attempting to prepare paperwork of some kind. Could be nothing. Could be a quitclaim deed. Could be an attempt to add Carolyn's name to a financial instrument tied to the property." She paused. "In any case, I want to know what it is before it becomes a problem." She told me to sit tight, to continue behaving normally, to document everything. She told me she would file a precautionary letter with the county recorder's office flagging the property address, which would require any subsequent deed changes to go through additional verification steps. She told me this could be done quietly and quickly, and that Marcus would not necessarily know it had happened. I drove home through the farmland on the back roads, the same way I drove to work every morning. The fields were still brown and flat from winter, but there were birds on the fence lines, and the sky was that particular pale blue that comes in early March before the real warmth arrives. I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, maybe months. Not happy, exactly. Steady. Like I had found the floor under my feet again. The flag on the property went on the following Monday. Patricia's paralegal handled it. I was teaching a unit on narrative voice to my third period class when it happened, and none of my students had any idea that their English teacher had just quietly made it significantly harder for anyone to tamper with the title of her house. The confrontation, when it came, was not the one I had been expecting. I had imagined it as a formal scene, a kitchen table, documents, lawyers. What actually happened was a Sunday dinner in mid-March, the cherry trees finally in full bloom outside, 10 days of improbable beauty right on schedule, and Carolyn sitting across from me with her hands folded and her particular smile in place, and Marcus at the head of the table looking at the centerpiece instead of at me. Carolyn had brought a woman with her. She introduced her as a friend from Westfield Park. The woman's name was Deborah Fitch. I recognized the name immediately. I kept my face perfectly still. Deborah was in her late 50s, pleasant-looking, with the careful posture of someone who was used to being in rooms where she wasn't quite a participant. She shook my hand. She complimented the house. She sat down at my table and accepted a glass of water and said very little for the first 20 minutes of dinner. Then Carolyn set something on the table next to the bread basket, a folded piece of paper. "I've been thinking," she said with the air of someone announcing a gift, "that given the nature of the original investment in this property, it would be fair, really only fair, to formalize a family arrangement. A simple document acknowledging that the family's commitment to this home extends in both directions." Marcus still wasn't looking at me. I looked at the paper. I did not touch it. "What kind of document?" I asked. "Just an acknowledgement," Carolyn said smoothly. "Something that recognizes Marcus's family's contribution to the household, his years of support, his income, and establishes a shared understanding about future decisions regarding the property." Deborah, I noticed, had shifted slightly in her chair. She was not looking at me either. "Deborah is a notary," Carolyn added, as if this were a pleasant coincidence. I let the silence sit for a moment. Outside, through the kitchen window, the cherry trees on Birchwood Lane were doing what they did every March, blooming in a way that made no argument, required no permission, simply arrived and was undeniable. "Carolyn," I said, "I need to tell you something." She smiled. "Of course. There is already a flag on this property with the county recorder, filed last Monday. Any deed modification, any title change, any notarized instrument affecting this address requires additional verification and notification to me directly." I looked at her. "So whatever is on that piece of paper, it won't be going anywhere tonight." The smile didn't disappear. It changed shape. It became something harder underneath. "I also need to tell you," I continued, "that I have a record of a call placed by Marcus to Ridgeline Middle School on February 28th, in which he raised questions about my mental state to my principal. That call lasted 12 minutes. I have the administrative log. I have a colleague who was present when the principal discussed the call, and I have an attorney who has reviewed all of it." Marcus looked up from the centerpiece. "And I have a neighbor of yours, Carolyn, who is prepared to describe in writing what she heard you say on the phone approximately 3 weeks ago, something about needing a place to land by summer." Deborah Fitch put her water glass down very carefully. "The document on the table," I said, "I'm not going to sign. You're welcome to take it home. I'd suggest showing it to your own attorney before you decide what to do next, because mine has already seen it. Or rather, she's seen what it was intended to accomplish, which is the same thing." Carolyn's hands were still folded, but her knuckles had gone white. Marcus said my name. Just my name. "Diane." "I'm not angry," I said, and I meant it. Or I meant it in the way that matters, which is that the anger had done its work weeks ago, in the dark, on the kitchen floor with Pepper, and now there was just clarity left. "I'm tired. I've been tired for a long time, but I am not confused and I am not unstable, and this house is not going anywhere except where I decide it goes." Deborah excused herself shortly after that. She was polite about it. She had the look of a woman who had just understood the full shape of what she'd been asked to participate in and wanted to put some distance between herself and it. I didn't blame her. I walked her to the door and said goodnight, and she said very quietly, "I'm sorry." And I believed her. Carolyn left 20 minutes later. She didn't say goodbye to me directly. She hugged Marcus in the entryway, and I heard her say something low that I couldn't make out, and then the front door closed, and the house was quiet. Marcus stood in the hallway. He looked like the man who had come back from my mother's house 3 weeks ago. That same expression, the one I'd laughed at then. Except this time, it wasn't funny. This time, it was just the face of someone who had run out of moves. "I want to understand something," I said. "Did you actually want the house? Or did you just want me not to have it on my own terms?" He didn't answer for a long moment. "I don't know," he finally said. It was, I think, the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. The divorce took 7 months. Patricia Lund was thorough and unhurried and very, very good, exactly as Wren had promised. The house stayed mine. The down payment documentation was unambiguous. The mortgage was refinanced into my name alone in October, which meant a new payment schedule, a slightly higher monthly figure, and a feeling when I signed the papers that I can only describe as the sensation of a door closing very firmly from the inside. Marcus moved into an apartment in Westfield Park, of all places, 3 buildings over from his mother's condo. I found that out from Ed, the retired postal worker across the street, who mentioned it without apparent irony one Saturday morning while I was raking leaves off the front walk. I thanked him for the information. I went back to raking. My mother came for dinner the first Sunday after the refinancing closed. She brought a casserole, because she always brings a casserole. We sat on the covered front porch in the October chill with blankets over our laps and coffee in our hands, and watched the street go quiet as the afternoon light went gold and low through the trees. "He really thought he could walk in there and talk me out of my own money," she said at one point. Not a question, just a statement, the way she sometimes narrated things she'd already processed. "I know," I said. "What did he think was going to happen?" I had thought about this a lot, actually. What Marcus had thought was going to happen when he drove over to my mother's house that Tuesday morning in early March.